Chapter 29, Middle Age Buddhist Teaching on Self with Vedantic and Western Comparisons, written and produced by Thomas Ty Seal, copyright Thomas Ty Seal unless otherwise noted. Having reviewed the Vedantic schools that arose in the Middle Ages, we turn now to consider how these Vedantic views on self, that is, Atman, compares with both older and Middle Age Buddhist views and with Western views on the nature of humans. Arguably, these are the most important theological comparisons. While oceans of commentary have been written on these views, this presentation seeks to provide a reasonable introduction to very important inter- and intra-religious theological discussions that have been going on for well over 1,000 years. At the end, I hope to show that the differences may not be as marked as many believe. As discussed in Chapter 14, prior to the Middle Ages, numerous schools of Buddhism had been established and continued to develop into the Middle Ages. These include the Middle Way, that is the Madhyamaka school, Pure Land Buddhism, Yogacara, various schools of meditation, and the Buddha Nature School, the Tathagata Garbha, from which the Chan school in China and the Zen school in Japan arose in the Middle Ages. Also new to the Middle Ages was the arrival of Vajrayana, that is Tibetan, Japanese, and Nepalese Buddhism. I'll start by reviewing what the oldest Buddhist text, the Pali Canon, says about the self and compare that to Vedantic text. Then I'll move on to consider comparisons across schools and in relation to Western theology and Taoism. The Middle Age doctrinal view is that the Hindu Vedantic and the Buddhist Middle Way, Madhyamaka view, are opposite in their understanding of self with a capital S. The Upanishads claim, developed by Shankara, who lived in the 8th century of the Common Era, whose non-dual understanding of Brahman and self is the foundation of Advaita, non-dual Vedanta, is that there is an eternal, unchanging self, Atman, that is ultimately identical with Brahman and that we are also that. The doctrinal Buddhist Madhyamaka view of Nagarjuna, who lived much earlier in the 2nd century of the Common Era, is that there is no inherent self to be found anywhere. These opposite views bear close examination, as they may not assert what is often assumed. But first, let's remind ourselves what the Buddha said about self. The Buddha claimed that the 5 aggregates, that is, form, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness, as well as the 6 senses, which includes the mind, and all phenomenal conditioned things, are not self. Further, a verse in the Middle Discourses reads, "If anyone says the eye is self, that is not tenable. If anyone says the ear is self, the nose is self, the tongue is self, the body is self, the mind is self, that is not tenable. If anyone says ideas are self, mind consciousness is self, mind contact is self, feeling is self, craving is self, that is not tenable." The Upanishads agree. The Kena Upanishad proclaims, "The eye does not go there, nor speech, nor mind. We do not know that. We do not know how to instruct one about it. It is distinct from the known and above the unknown. We have heard it so stated by preceptors who taught us that." That's a powerful convergence. If there is a reflection of the divine self, that is Brahman, in us, it is beyond anything associated with our body and mind. The Hindu Katha Upanishad extends the convergence into Western theology. The verse reads, "Not by speech, not by mind, not by eye can he be attained, except in his case who says, he is, How can that be known? Recall God's call to Moses, who proclaimed, "I am who I am." All three traditions, then, Buddhism, Hinduism, and Abrahamic faiths proclaim God, Brahman, or the ultimate reality simply is, and this understanding is the beginning of faith. As mentioned before, nowhere in the Pali scripture does the Buddha say that there is no self. He only said that personal faculties and thoughts are not self, by which he meant that they are not an enduring, independent self. As we saw in chapter 14, the Buddha had opportunities to affirm or reject the existence of a metaphysical self, but he refused to do so. He explained that either answer would tie him to one of two opposing positions of his time. One held that the self is eternal, a confusing proposition if we identify the self with our ever-changing body and mind, and potentially a source of attachment if we cling to an eternal self as mine. The opposing proposition held that the self is annihilated at death, an equally problematic view if we assume there is a self that must somehow survive. The Buddha argued that neither position leads to liberation from suffering. Rather than resolving the metaphysical question, he directed attention to the practical problem of clinging to anything as I or mine. What he did teach is that the world is empty because it is empty of self or of anything pertaining to self. This verse is capable of different interpretations. A conservative view is that the phrase, "the world is empty because it is empty of self," simply means that nothing in the world outside of ourself is owned by self, whereas the phrase, "anything pertaining to self," means that neither do we own our body and mind. In essence, the Buddha is likely saying that nothing in the world or in our body and mind belongs to us. This leaves open the possibility that there is something divine beyond ourself, or what Hindus would call Atman. Indeed, that seems to be the message behind the Buddha's assertion, "There is, monks, an unborn, unbecome, unmade, unconditioned. If, monks, there were not that, you could not know an escape from the born, become, made, and conditioned. But because there is, you do know an escape from the born, become, made, and conditioned." That aligns with the Upanishadic claim that all this, everything, is Brahman. Everything comes from Brahman. Everything goes back to Brahman, and everything is sustained by Brahman. This very self, Atman, is Brahman. That is, there is an unborn, unconditioned reality behind and sustaining everything. Or, as the Bible has put it, "To the Lord your God belong the heavens, even the highest heavens, the earth, and everything in it." We own nothing, not even ourselves, as Psalm 24 explained. The earth is the Lord's, and everything in it, the world and all who live in it. So, given the similarities between Upanishadic and Buddhist thought and the earliest Buddhist scripture, the Pali Canon, how did the doctrinal differences between the Hindu Vedantic and Buddhist middle way, Madhyamaka views develop? The roots of this development can be traced to what is thought to be the earliest surviving Mahayana scripture, composed around the beginning of the Common Era and known in English as the Perfection of Wisdom in 8,000 lines, or in Sanskrit as Asta Sahastrika Prajna Parimatya. This sutra exerts that all dharmas are empty. Here, dharma is interpreted to mean anything that can be identified, conceived, or experienced, And this not only includes the five aggregates, the forms, feelings, perceptions, mental phenomena, and consciousness, which we know from the Pali Canon are not self, but anything that can be conceived. And that includes self, Atman, time, space, nirvana, Buddhahood, the teachings, even emptiness itself. The seed of all dharmas being emptied, planted in this Perfection of Wisdom Sutra, was further reified, as we mentioned, in the teachings of Nagarjuna, the great Buddhist philosopher who lived from about 150 to 250 of the Common Era, and thus had access to the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra. Nagarjuna doubled down on the teaching that everything is empty of inherent existence. Even emptiness is empty. It is not a hidden substance or ultimate entity behind appearances. Nagarjuna is thus regarded as the founder of what became known as the Middle Way, Madhyamaka movement, which is still a major philosophical school of Mahayana Buddhism. Both the Heart Sutra and the Diamond Sutra, which appeared several hundred years after the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra, are condensed versions of this sutra and likely reflects the views of Nagarjuna. Nagarjuna's reasoning that everything is empty of independent existence would apply equally to any concept of Brahman or God described by positive attributes. For example, if Brahman is described as light, the concept of light is intelligible only in contrast to darkness. Thus, the concept of light is conceptually dependent and cannot possess inherent independence. When we think of Brahman or God as being an eternal, conscious, immutable, self-luminous, blissful creator, all descriptive words used in the Upanishads, those qualities are also not independent from their opposites, temporary, unconscious, changing, dark, miserable creature. Thus, from a Madhyamaka perspective of Nagarjuna, any conceptualization of Brahma is itself empty of intrinsic nature. That is, it does not have an existence belonging solely to its own nature, independent of causes, conditions, parts, conceptual designation, or anything else. Note that Nagarjuna was arguing more than that words derive their meaning through contrast, but that any reality that is dependently arisen lacks intrinsic nature. Light as an essence, for example, cannot exist without darkness. Nagarjuna would further question how something that is said to be wholly independent could stand in any explanatory or causal relation to the world. If Brahman truly had no dependence whatsoever, then its relation to the world would itself become difficult to account for. It is, for example, hard to imagine a creator without a creation. It is important to note, however, that Nagarjuna never claimed that Brahman does not exist. Rather, in effect, he claimed that if you assert that Brahman is the only ultimate existing, possessing the quality of intrinsic nature, that assertion does not withstand logical analysis. Nagarjuna avoided saying both that Brahman exists and that Brahman does not exist. That is his middle way, Madhyamaka. What he asserted is that any conceptual assertion about Brahman, such as Brahman has qualities, is empty, not that Brahman is empty. Interestingly, this point brings the Buddhist Nagarjuna surprisingly close to the Advaitist Shankara. Both taught that Brahman is beyond predicates, beyond relation, beyond number, and beyond thought. Both thinkers insist that ultimate reality transcends conceptual description, although they drew different philosophical conclusions from that shared conviction. Shankara affirmed that Brahman is the one ultimate reality delivering salvation, whereas Nagarjuna refused to affirm any ultimate entity possessing intrinsic existence, and that transcendence is freedom from all conceptual views. There may, however, be something beyond concepts. While Madhyamaka focuses on deconstructing reality by emphasizing the emptiness of all phenomena, Yogacara focuses on exploring how our reality is constructed by consciousness. As discussed in Chapter 14, the Buddhist Yogacara, mind-only movement, which began around the 2nd century of the Common Era, reached its peak during the Middle Ages. It advanced the position that the subject-object differences we perceive in normal life are dependently arisen cognitive processes. Thus, they are produced by the mind, and this gives rise to the designation mind-only. The goal in Buddhist Yogacara is not to recognize an underlying self or Atman, as in Vedanta of Hinduism, but to be free of subject-object duality, such as a belief in a subject, self, which presupposes an object, not self. This, of course, sounds a lot like the non-dual teachings of Advaita Vedanta. The Buddha spoke of 6 types of consciousness: the consciousness of the 5 senses and the mind. Yogacharans added 2 more to explain karmic continuity across lifetimes and why people share the same sense of the world. They added a 7th consciousness called manas, which appropriates experience as belonging to self, and an 8th consciousness known as storehouse consciousness, which stores karmic imprints, memories, and habits, and is the functional agent for reincarnation. Yogacara teaches that all forms of conditioned consciousness, including the 7th manas and the 8th, the storehouse consciousness, are not self because they arise dependently and are therefore empty of inherent existence. The 7th consciousness generates the illusion of an enduring I, while the 8th provides karmic continuity, but neither is an eternal self. This aligns the Yogacara view quite closely with the Madhyamaka understanding of self as being dependently arisen. Both traditions deny that any self possesses inherent existence, although they arrive at this conclusion by different routes. Madhyamaka begins with the principle that all dharmas are empty of inherent existence and therefore no self can exist independently. Yogacara begins with an analysis of consciousness, showing that every level of consciousness is dependently arisen and empty, and therefore cannot constitute an enduring self. Buddhist Yogacara aligns with Hindu Advaita in that both believe our ordinary experience fundamentally misrepresents reality. Hindu Advaita strives to correct this error by removing ignorance, the belief that there is an independent self when there is only Brahman. Buddhist Yogacara seeks to remove this error by understanding that neither subject nor object independently exist. They are codependent and thus dependently arisen. Beyond that, nothing can be claimed. In recognizing the dependent nature of subject and object, liberation in Yogacara is achieved by no longer clinging to either subject or object. Both Hindu Advaita and Buddhist Yogacara involve transforming consciousness to understand the oneness of reality. They just reach different conclusions. As to the experience of practitioners of each method, Yogacharans would be more likely to characterize their experience as attaining a state of wisdom and seeing things as they really are. Advaitas would be more likely to report bliss, contentment, and self-luminosity. Of the two, I prefer the latter, but descriptions of the subject-object free state by each group of practitioners may be culturally conditioned by the two communities. Whether there's an actual difference remains debatable. While both Madhyamaka and Yogacara Buddhism make no claims about there being in us an underlying self, which is Brahman, Tathagatagarbha Buddhism makes claims about the nature of this underlying reality. Recall that around the year 200 of the Common Era, give or take 100 years, oral transmission of what is known as the Tathagatagarbha Sutra began in what is now modern-day Afghanistan. Somewhere around the year 300, plus or minus 100 years, it was committed to writing in some type of Sanskrit, though this version is lost. Approaching the Middle Ages, versions written in Chinese appeared, which caused this movement to grow in China. The text reads as a discourse given by the Buddha at Vulture Peak near Rajagra, which is now known as Rajgir in northeast India. The prologue states that 10 years after attaining enlightenment, the Buddha in the company of bodhisattvas, that is, enlightened beings on the path to Buddhahood, caused a countless number of lotus flowers to appear in the sky for an instant. In the center of each flower, an image of a Buddha appeared, which radiated light. The text calls to mind various miracles performed by Jesus as a prelude to explaining spiritual truths. Perplexed, the disciples ask, "O world-honored one, why are there conjured Buddha images and all of the innumerable flowers?" The Buddha explained, "Good sons, there is a great essence called the Tathagatagarbha. It was because I wanted to expound it to you that I showed you these signs." He then explained, "In a similar fashion, as you've seen with the Buddha images and the flowers, good sons, when I regard all beings with my Buddha eye, I see that hidden within the kleshas, the negative mental traits of greed, desire, anger, and stupidity, there is seated augustly and unmovingly the Tathagata's wisdom, the Tathagata's vision, and the Tathagata's body. Good sons, all beings, though they find themselves with all sorts of kleshas, having a Tathagatagarbha that is eternally unsullied, and that is replete with virtues, no different from my own." In short, the verses claim we all have Buddha nature within us. The Buddha then provided several other analogies, saying this hidden Buddha nature within is like pure honey in a cave, or a tree surrounded and protected by countless swarm of bees, a kernel of wheat that has not yet had its husk removed, the genuine gold that has been fallen into a pit of waste and been submerged and not seen for years, a pit inside a mango fruit which does not decay. When you plant it in the ground, it grows into the largest and most regal of trees. A woman who is impoverished, vile, ugly, and hated by others, who bears a noble son in her womb. A master foundryman, casting a statue of pure gold. After casting is complete, it is inverted and placed on the ground. Although the outside is scorched and blackened, the inside is unchanged. This sutra clearly aligns Buddha nature within the Vedantic notions of Atman within. Another important Tathagatagarbha text is the Mahaparinirvana Sutra, often simply called the Nirvana Sutra. It appears as a Chinese text at the beginning of the Middle Ages. Like the Tathagatagarbha Sutra, its origin in India as an oral text lies several hundred years earlier. The Nirvana Sutra uses the Buddha's final nirvana to discuss Buddha nature. Here, the relation between the Buddha's teaching on Buddha nature and Hindu Atman is even more clear. Chapter 12 of this sutra begins, Kasyapa, a disciple, said to the Buddha, O world-honored one, is there self in the 25 existences, a more compressed version of the 31 planes of existence one can be reborn into, or not? The Buddha said, O good man, self means Tathagata Garbha, Buddha womb, Buddha embryo, Buddha nature, emphasis added. Every being has Buddha nature. This is the self. Such self has, from the very beginning, been under cover of innumerable defilements. That is why man cannot see it. At the beginning of the Middle Ages, a Buddhist scholar felt that earlier Tathagata Garbha scriptures explaining Buddha nature had strayed too close to Hindu Atman. He composed a work called the Lankavatara Sutra, which translates as the descent into Lanka, meaning the Buddha's mythical visit to Sri Lanka. The sutra is set in a mythical realm, and while presented as a conversation between the Bhagavan, that is the Buddha, and bodhisattvas, it is clearly the creation of the scholar. In chapter 2 of the Lankavatara Sutra, the bodhisattva Mahamati recounted the Tathagata Garbha teaching that there is a gem of great value hidden in the body of every being, noting that it is said to be eternal, permanent, auspicious, and unchangeable. He then asked the Bhagavan, is not this Tathagata Garbha taught by the Bhagavan the same as the ego, self, substance taught by the Vedantic philosophers? The ego, as taught in the system of the philosophers, is an eternal creator, unqualified, omnipresent, and imperishable. The Bhagavan replied, No, Mahamati, my Tathagata Garbha is not the same as the ego taught by the philosophers, for what the Tathagatas teach is the Tathagata Garbha in the sense, Mahamati, that it is emptiness, reality limit, nirvana, being unborn, unqualified, and devoid of will effort. The reason why the Tathagatas, who are arhats and fully enlightened ones, teach the doctrine pointing to the Tathagata Garbha is to make the ignorant cast aside their fear when they listen to the teaching of egolessness, and to have them realize the state of non-discrimination and imagelessness. In essence, the sutra taught that Tathagata Garbha is a skillful means to attract those attached to the idea of self, whereas in reality it is not different from emptiness and dependent origination. In short, it seeks to lessen the claims of earlier Tathagata Garbha sutras that align it with Atman, rendering it instead as the emptiness and suchness realized when dualistic thinking ceases. The Lankavatara Sutra is clearly a philosophical attempt to reconcile Tathagata Garbha thought and Yogacarga philosophy. It's true, Tathagata Garbha, only inasmuch as it kept Buddha nature but redefined it. As to the emptiness it leaves us with, it is certainly empty of self, that is, individual ego, and it may be conceptually empty, as all concepts are constructions. Advaita Vedanta would agree. But the big question is, what is it? Here I lean toward the earlier Tathagata Garbha and Vedantic views that what is left is a holy reality, though it may be an awkward fit to call it self with a capital S. Huayan, that is, flower garden Buddhism, was a major school of Mahayana Buddhism that arose in China in the 6th century as a branch of Tathagata Garbha. The voluminous Flower Garland Sutra is considered its principal text. It teaches that Buddha nature pervades the universe. The Flower Garland Sutra reads, "The Buddha, with unprecedented great compassion, enters all states of existence to help sentient beings, explaining truth, encouraging virtue, promoting fulfillment. This is known as I Light." The Buddha's wisdom is boundless. It has no equal in the world. It has no attachment. Compassionately responding to beings, it manifests everywhere. Great fame has realized this path. In all atoms of all lands, Buddha enters each and every one, producing miracle displays for sentient beings. Such is the way of Vairocana. The Buddha's knowledge is like space. It has no end. His light shines throughout the 10 directions. He knows the mental patterns of all sentient beings. There is no world he does not enter. Similarly, the knowledge of Buddha, infinite and unobstructive, universally able to benefit all, is fully inherent in the bodies of sentient beings, but the ignorant, because of clinging to deluded notions, do not know of it, are not aware of it, and so do not benefit from it. Here we see the Buddhist parallel to what in Judaism is God's divine presence, pervading all and inspiring the prophets, and what in Christianity is called the Holy Spirit, and Islam, Ruh al-Qudus. The Flower Garland Sutra describes an encounter between Maitreya, the Buddha to come, and a bodhisattva named Sudana. Sudana asked Maitreya how an enlightened being is to learn and carry out the practice of enlightening beings. Maitreya then told him to go into a great tower containing the ornaments of Vairocana, the great Sun Buddha whose Buddha body fills all worlds. Entering the tower, Sudana saw that it was as vast as all space and immeasurably wide and filled with all manner of precious things. The verse then recounts, "Also inside the great tower he saw hundreds of thousands of other towers similarly arrayed. He saw those towers as infinitely vast as space, evenly arrayed in all directions. Yet these towers were not mixed up with one another, being each mutually distinct, while appearing reflected in each and every object of all the other towers." The key phrase here is that these towers were not mixed up with one another, being each mutually distinct. Rather, the countless worlds seen there were reflected in every other tower, interpenetrating them without obstruction. The great Chinese flower garland philosopher Fazang, who lived from 643 to 712 of the Common Era and was the third patriarch of flower garland, that is, Huayan Buddhism, used this and other passages to assert that, as Buddha nature is in every sentient being, every phenomena reflects and includes all others, while remaining itself. He employed the doctrinal phrases, "one is all and all is one," and "one and many mutually contain each other without obstruction," to capture the idea that the identity of any phenomena depends upon the total network of all other phenomena. Given this, there can be no individual self. Every phenomena is what it is only because every other phenomena is what it is. Thus, it all arises by dependent origination. We've seen earlier that this is what the Vietnamese monk Thich Nhat Hanh, who recently died, called interbeing. As nothing belongs to self, the fundamental human vice then is selfishness, and the reason why the Buddha taught not self instead of no self. In the 6th century, another sutra called the Awakening of Faith surfaced, and in chapter 1 opened with the promise of describing the true meaning of Mahayana, which it claimed was the doctrine that one universal mind, that is, the Tathagatagarbha, has two aspects: suchness, the absolute reality, and arising and ceasing, the phenomenal world of change. Each of these two aspects, the sutra claimed, embraces all states of existence. Why? Because these two aspects are mutually inclusive. The previously mentioned Fazang explained that because these two aspects are mutually inclusive, reality is conceived as the intersection of the absolute order and the phenomenal order. The absolute order is thought to be transcendental and yet is conceived as not being outside the phenomenal order. Again, the phenomenal order is thought to be temporal and yet is conceived as not being outside the absolute order. In other words, this one mind is the Tathagatagarbha, the source from which all individual minds arise and which pervades everything. This, they say, is the most important Mahayana teaching. Severe anti-Buddhist persecution under Emperor Suzong of the Tang in the 9th century led to the dissolution of Huayan, the flower garland Buddhism, but its ideas carried into Chan Buddhism in China and Zen in Japan, as well as to Huayom in Korea and Kigon in Japan. In the Middle Ages, Chan Buddhism in China and Zen Buddhism in Japan arose borrowing from the earlier Tathagatagarbha. Tradition has it that near the year 600 of the Common Era, a monk named Bodhidharma from South India or Central Asia brought Chan Buddhism to China. Chan Buddhism split into a southern school associated with Weining and a somewhat different northern school associated with Shinju. Zen Buddhism arrived in Japan beginning between the 7th and 9th centuries, with a later wave in the 12th and 13th centuries. While philosophically similar to Chan, Zen is generally more rigid and stylized than Chan, whose practices have more variety and which absorbed elements of Taoism. Chan's major claim is that awakening is not a gradual accumulation of merit or doctrinal mastery, but a direct, non-conceptual recognition of one's own nature, what Tathagatagarbha calls Buddha nature. This calls to mind the Christian evangelical belief in suddenly being saved and transformed by the grace of Jesus. Chan and Zen also rely more on teacher-to-student transmission rather than reliance on scripture, and these approaches are famous for using silence and koans, paradoxical questions used to stop logical thinking. As with Tathagatagarbha, the Nirvana Sutra, with its claim that all sentient beings possess Buddha nature, is an important Chan Buddhist work, as is the previously mentioned Awakened of Faith treatise, which teaches that a single reality called one mind encompasses all pure and defiled states. As to Atman, while doctrinally Chan aligns with Madhyamaka and Yogacara view that there is no self, its adoption of Tathagatagarbha Buddha nature and one mind strongly suggests an underlying divine reality, or Atman, to which the standard defensive reply is that Buddha or self-nature is just another name for emptiness, which in Chan Buddhism has soteriological properties, again aligning it with Hindu Atman. Over time, Chan practices were absorbed into various Mahayana schools, especially Pure Land Buddhism. Recall that Pure Land Buddhism is quite different than other Mahayana branches and is centered around the vows of Dharmakara, a king from many eons ago and perhaps a different cosmos, who renounced his throne after encountering a Buddha named Lokasavaraja. He made 48 vows to establish the perfect Pure Land, and after ages of practice he fulfilled those vows and became Amitabha, the infinite light Buddha. He promised that anyone who sincerely called upon his name would be reborn in this Pure Land, where they could attain enlightenment. The story is told in the Longer Sukhavativyana Sutra, also known as the Longer Amitabha Sutra, which dates somewhere around the year 200 of the Common Era. Those stories of devotion to Amitabha can be found as early as 1st century BCE around the ancient Gandhara Silk Road civilization in Pakistan and northeastern Afghanistan. Approaching the Middle Ages, a Chinese monk named Huaiyuan organized the White Lotus Society in 402 of the Common Era. These monks vowed before an image of Amitabha that they would be reborn in the Pure Land. This is considered the entry point of Pure Land Buddhism in China. Around the same time, the shorter Amitabha Sutra was composed, and this helped Pure Land concepts spread in China. In the 5th century, the Contemplation Sutra further advanced Pure Land thought, and around the year 650 of the Common Era, it emerged as a distinct school. Over time, Pure Land Buddhism was absorbed as a practice within Chan Buddhism. In the 7th century of the Common Era, Buddhism reached Tibet. By the 8th century, it was firmly established. In the 9th century, however, it was officially repressed, and it was not until the 10th and 11th centuries when it began to resurface again, aided by Tibetan scholars who traveled to India to recover authentic teachings and bring them back to Tibet. During this time, a Buddhist Indian master named Atisa was invited by the king of Western Tibet to help restore Buddhism after its decline. Atisa composed what is known as the Lamp for the Path to Enlightenment. It outlined Buddhist histories and beliefs in 67 verses. Over time, others expanded this outline, and in 1402 of the Common Era, the Buddhist monk Tsongkhapa developed it into a comprehensive philosophical and practical manual spanning hundreds of pages called the Great Treatise on the Stages of the Path, which even today is an important guide to Buddhist teachings and practice. As to Buddha nature, Tathagata Garbha, and Atman, self, two broad approaches emerged in Tibet. The Rangtong adopted the Madhyamaka interpretation that everything, including Buddha nature, is empty of intrinsic existence. Thus, Buddha nature only refers to emptiness of mind. The Shentong, most famously associated with Dopopa Sherab Gyatso, taught that the ultimate reality is empty only of conditioned phenomena, but not its own enlightened qualities, such as eternal wisdom, compassion, and luminosity. This puts it back in the early Tathagata Garbha camp. All Tibetan schools accept the Four Noble Truths: dependent origination, no permanent self, karma and rebirth, the bodhisattva ideal, and emptiness, but each has developed unique features. The Nyingma, the ancient school, is known for its teaching of Dzogchen, great perfection. The goal is to recognize your true nature, that lies like a sun hidden behind clouds. They believe the practitioner can directly recognize and experience the primordial nature of awareness, not requiring complex doctrinal understanding. While this sounds very much like non-dual Advaitic Vedanta, the ancient school claims the experience is not of an eternal underlying reality, but the realized nature of awakened mind. Kagyu is the oral lineage school. As with Nyingma, Kagyu prioritizes experience over analyzing philosophical concepts. Its approach, however, is different. Its teachers ask learners to focus on questions such as, where do thoughts come from? Can the thinker be found? It seeks through this to reveal what is called Mahamudra, the Great Seal, in which only luminous awareness exists. In Kagyu, they believe that while all phenomena are empty, emptiness is not mere absence. Rather, it is luminous, knowing, and compassionate. Sakya, the Pale Earth school, is known for integrating the path, that is, philosophical understanding, and fruit, tantric practices. The central tantric practice is Hivajra deity yoga, where a practitioner starts with the heartfelt wish to free all living beings from pain, then visualizing the universe as a pure mandala, then visualizing oneself as the god Hijvara, who embodies perfect wisdom and compassion, then reciting the deity's mantra before finally resolving back to emptiness. Gelug, the Way of Virtue school, was founded in the late 14th and early 15th centuries. It emphasizes gradual training through the previously mentioned Lamrim, the great treatise on the sages of the path. It involves rigorous philosophical analysis and formal debate and uses the Indian philosopher Shankrakurti's interpretation of Madhyamaka, in which he introduced his famous 7-point rejection of an independent self, extending the short chariot analogy in the Samyutta Nikaya of the Pali Canon. The Dalai Lama belongs to the Gelug tradition. While I've been focusing on Buddhist and Vedantic comparisons, it's good to note similarities between Taoist and Advaita views of Brahman within. We discussed Taoist movements that started in the years just prior to the Middle Ages in Chapter 18. During the Middle Ages, these Taoist schools ebbed and flowed. The meditation practice of the Taoist school of highest clarity, Shangjing, have some similarities to those in some Buddhist communities. Both visualize divine beings, contemplate inner light, and strive to transform consciousness. The Taoist Lingbao school absorbed the Mahayana teachings of universal salvation through bodhisattvas. Taoist internal alchemy, Naidan, has similarities with Buddhist practices such as breath meditation. For both, the goal is an inner transformation. A major difference, however, is that the Tao is not seen as empty, as in Madhyamaka, or dependent, as in Yogacara. Rather, it's viewed as an inexhaustible, generative source. The Taoist view of the ultimate reality is more akin to the Buddhist Tathagata Garbha. What is emptiness? Is it a divine reality as an Atman, or just an individual state of awareness, as Buddhist schools generally assert? Is the ineffable, ultimate, a positive absolute, Brahman, as Advaita Vedanta claims? Or is it what Buddhist schools generally claim, a positive, non-dual awareness achieved by a negative, emptying attachment to all conditioned phenomena? Both traditions agree that the ultimate transcends conceptual thought and ordinary distinctions, and some later Buddhist schools describe emptiness in terms such as luminosity and compassion that resemble descriptions of Brahman. Debate within Buddhist schools and between Buddhist and Hindu schools as to what liberation is and if it involves a sacred reality has continued for nearly 2 millennia. All of this, however, is speculative theology. The Buddha was not focused on metaphysics, but on relieving suffering by following the Eightfold Path. In terms of the nature of human beings and our relation to ultimate reality, some forms of Mahayana Buddhism are not nearly as far from Western theological and mystical thought as one might suppose. Western traditions hold that humans have spiritual capacities that reflect God's attributes. As the Bible put it, God created mankind in his own image. This provides striking points of comparison with several Buddhist traditions. In Tathagatagarbha, all beings possess Buddha nature, obscured by adventitious defilements, resembling the idea that a divine nature or image of God lies within us, waiting to be uncovered. In Flower Garland, Huayan Buddhism, all reality is an infinitely interconnected whole, permeated by the wisdom and activity of the all-pervading Sun Buddha, Vairocana, echoing the Western view that a divine presence, the Holy Spirit, permeates creation. In Chan and Zen Buddhism, our original nature or Buddha nature is not created through practice, but directly realized, resembling Western mystical traditions that speak of discovering a deeper divine presence within. In the ancient school, the Nyingma of Tibetan Buddhism, there is the great perfection, Dzogchen. Liberation comes through awareness of our primordial, pure, true nature, like discovering a sun hidden behind clouds. This partially resonates with Western traditions that suggest that our true spiritual nature is obscured by our ignorance and misdeeds. In the Tibetan oral lineage, the Kagyu school, the Great Seal, Mahamudra, seeks direct recognition of primordial luminous awareness. While they do not consider this a discovery of God or Brahman, what they experience may be the same that Western mystics experience, with just a different name. In mind-only Yogacara Buddhism, ordinary dualistic consciousness is said to be transformed into non-dual wisdom. Its language of luminosity, purity, and suchness offers parallels with Western mystical ideas of an underlying spiritual reality. Nagarjuna's middle way, Madhyamaka, with its teaching that even emptiness is empty and therefore has no inherent qualities, would seem to be the outlier. Yet, if all qualities and distinctions are dependent upon their opposites, then nothing possesses inherent existence. If, however, ultimate reality is beyond conceptual understanding, there may be a deeper unity from which apparent dualities emerge, as we see in a very different context in modern physics, where a more fundamental state can give rise to apparently opposed phenomena, such as matter and antimatter. In the Pali Canon, the Buddha describes the mind as luminous, though obscured by adventitious defilements. While this does not teach a universal cosmic mind, the image of innate luminosity, obscured by defilements, became an important foundation for later Buddhist Mahayana thought. As you've seen, major Buddhist schools proclaim that a divine reality described as primordial, pure, and luminous, and often known as Buddha nature, is discoverable within or is believed to permeate the entire universe, where it sustains and shapes spiritual growth. In all but name, This view is concordant with Western understandings of the divine forces that guide and sustain humanity. Before we leave this chapter, it's important to note that as with the schools of Vedantic thought, the Buddhist schools of thought about the relation between humans and ultimate reality are all speculative religious philosophy. The Buddha himself stopped short of elaborating metaphysical reality, being focused, as we said, on relieving suffering through teachings of the Noble Eightfold Path. What we do know, however, is that there is one ultimate reality, which all religions and religious philosophers try to explain. Philosophers can at best suggest possibilities as to its nature and our relation to it. As we shall see as we continue our review of religions and philosophers, there is more yet to consider on this topic. We move on now to look at Muslim and Sikh philosophers and empires in the Middle Ages from about 1400 to 1650.